G'day folks, my name is Rob. Welcome back to another F1 Fantasy video. Today we are looking at my team selection for the British Grand Prix this coming weekend. So if you are new around here, be sure to drop a like on the video and subscribe to the channel if you haven't done so. I want to get this Austrian Grand Prix review straight out of the way. I had 169 points, and from what looked like a near perfect weekend up until about lap 63 on the Sunday, it turned into an absolute horror show for my team. Lando and Max, being so far ahead of the rest of the field, were obviously jostling for that position at the front, and I honestly thought it could have gone either way. There were quite a few different dives from Lando in the lead up to the incident, and was hoping it would just end cleanly, and one of them, regardless of who it was, for at least the sake of the fantasy team this weekend, emerged victorious. Now, I also don't have a vested interest in McLaren or Red Bull all that much, so I just like to see good racing, but obviously didn't end well and pretty much demolished any chance I had of a green arrow as a result of that, even though Lando came away with another Driver of the Day award. Not nearly enough to salvage the carnage for my team. I stupidly did a back calculation of what I potentially could have scored aside from the DNFs, the positions lost and all that stuff. Fastest lap, I think Red Bull also had at one point towards the end there. And I think I was somewhere between 75 and 100 points off what I ultimately ended up with. I still think, though, in the lead up to the deadline, I wouldn't change a thing about the decisions I made. I think at the point in time, they were the right ones to maximize the points for the weekend. And I think it honestly, up until the incident in the Grand Prix, looked like it had worked out as I'd planned. So it just goes to show in fantasy, sometimes you need a bit of good luck, sometimes you experience a bit of bad luck, and I've had my fair share of both this season. It's obviously a shame, but you just can't dwell on it too much. I'll keep moving forward and sharing with you guys the information I hope can make our decision-making process a little easier and a little better, but not that great for the rank. 7.9k, which was about 3,000 places from last week. I'm in a bit of a slump right now. I was sitting at around 3.2k after Monaco, and on the back of some mixed results, certainly on the wrong side of these results, in Canada, in Spain, and now in Austria, it does seem like there's a little bit of work to do to climb back into at least the top 5,000. The goal was certainly top 1,000 at the start of the season, and I think there's going to have to be a few strategic decisions and a little bit of luck as well to get back to that point. But right now, just inside the top 8,000, and not a great Austrian Grand Prix weekend all in all. Before we jump into how my team is shaping up for Silverstone, I wanted to take a couple of looks at drivers in the spotlight following Austria. Now, the first guy I wanted to check out was Oscar Piastri. He had a great result to capitalize on the misfortune of Lando Norris and Max Verstappen. 42 points, his best result of the season. His podium as well, another P2 to go along with the one he had in Monaco. Now, I don't think that Oscar was by any means the best driver on track or close to that over the entire Grand Prix, but he certainly had his moments, and I think the fact that he was at least able to position himself to capitalize on any opportunities like the one that came up obviously meant he was rewarded with another P2. And I think Oscar's really had a little bit of misfortune over the last half dozen or so races. He looked really good in Miami until he ran in with Sainz. In Imola, I believe it was P2 he qualified, and then got that grid place penalty in qualifying, and then obviously showed some really good form in Monaco to finish P2. So it's been a little bit of a mixed bag for him, and I have over the last few weeks suggested that there is going to be that breakthrough result for him very soon. Now, P2 is a great result for a driver in only his second year in Formula One, but I do think it would be certainly not outside the realms of possibility if we saw him win at least one race before the season is out. So I'm just quite impressed with his maturity, his cool head under pressure for the most part. And I do think that he certainly comes into my thought process heading into Silverstone. Maybe I don't ultimately go with him, but by the same token, I think now that we're past what is the last sprint race until Circuit of the Americas in October, the B tier lineup, or the double B tier lineup, which has been coined by a couple of different folks in the F1 fantasy community, makes me think that he paired with another of the Mercedes or Ferrari drivers, or even maybe Lando Norris, certainly becomes a viable option. So I'm really liking Oscar. He has consistently performed throughout the season. He hasn't had a DNF, and I know now that I've said it, I've probably jinxed him for this next Grand Prix, but he is, in a very good car. I would still say the best on the grid after Austria. Qualifies very well, and we know tyre management's probably not his strongest suit, but I think that's no doubt just going to improve race to race. And I think at 17% owned, probably is on the lower side of ownership when you look at the likes of the Charles Leclercs, the Lewis Hamiltons, the Carlos Sainz's, even Lando Norris, all of which, actually, I'd probably take Hamilton out of the equation there because he's less owned than Oscar, but the Ferrari duo, Max Verstappen, Oscar Piastri, all much lower owned than those guys. So I do think he certainly becomes an option just for his consistency and reliability in a car that does look like a proven race-winning vehicle. So I very much like Oscar for the upcoming slate of races, and I do think at his price point of 22 million, certainly will factor into quite a few people's plans if they don't already own the Aussie. I also want to look at George Russell, who won his second race in his career. Much like Oscar, made the most of the misfortune of Verstappen and Lando ending the race far from where they started it. And I do think George has, again, like Oscar, continued to build on some consistent performances. Mercedes is a much more competitive car than what we saw in the first 5 or 6 races of the season. And George, again, like Oscar, hasn't had a DNF this season. Yes, I know he had that incident in Australia, but by that point, he'd already finished more than 90% of the full race distance. So like Lando Norris in Austria, he didn't get hit with that minus 20. He just lost however many positions in Australia from what his starting grid position was. So another very reliable driver. Yes, we are aware that some issues and errors can creep into his driving, certainly when there's a bit more pressure. And I think the fact that he wasn't competing for the race meant there maybe wasn't quite as much expectation on him to convert that to a race win. But, there were incidents in Canada. We saw him, obviously, in Australia, as I mentioned, crash out, and then Singapore last year. So, obviously something to think about, but I think the fact that he's only scored less than 23 once in his last 5 in a car that seems to be going from strength to strength makes me think that, again, could be much like Oscar at 21 odd million, a candidate in our teams for those double B tier lineups. So George, I'm really liking the look of, and again, qualifies pretty well, top 6, I would say, most of the time, and one of, if not the lowest owned asset in the game at 10%. So at least in terms of drivers, he is, I'm just checking here, he is the lowest, tied with Sergio Perez at 10%. So a huge differential. And I do think that George becomes attractive for someone like me who has dropped a little bit lately. All I need is one banger of a race from him, and he's shooting me back up the ranks. So certainly someone I'm entertaining. I wouldn't say I've jumped on the idea of him just yet, but I am certainly thinking about a driver like George because of the fact that he is consistent, he's in a good car, and I don't think necessarily team orders will come into play for Mercedes. They'll probably let both George and Lewis race one another, but I do think the fact that he is staying beyond this season suggests to me at least that there may well be just a little bit of favoritism in Mercedes garage, so just keep an eye on that. But I do think, that aside, George comes with a level of consistency at the moment that maybe we're not seeing from some other B tier drivers. So really liking the look of George heading into his home Grand Prix in Silverstone this weekend. Now, in terms of some key takeaways from the weekend, I've obviously talked about the double B tier driver lineup versus running one A tier driver in Norris or Verstappen. And I think you can make a case for both, absolutely. The one thing for me that's compelling to go with Lando Norris And I think now that we're not on sprint weekends, he probably is slightly more appealing, or I'd say much more appealing to me than Max Verstappen, at least because of the fact that he has that driver of the day consistency. It is almost a guaranteed 10 points, 6 of the last 7, if I'm not mistaken. And the fact that he didn't even finish the race and still won it makes me think that Lando versus 2 double Bs like a Lewis and a Piastri, for example, is going to be close. But I think the fact that you've probably just got a higher floor with 2 B-tier drivers makes me think that that could be the strategy many of us employ for the next few races. There's quite a number of races until we get to the next sprint race weekend where I think that may change things up a little bit. But for the foreseeable future, I am liking the 2 B-tier driver lineup. And as well as a result of that, you're going to probably have to leverage the affordable nature of Ferrari and Mercedes to get a team like that. We'll get into that in a moment in terms of how that could look, but I do think Red Bull, for me, certainly loses a lot more viability on these non-sprint weekends. Sure, they've got the pit stops, but I really was hoping for just a tad more from Sergio Perez, and the fact that Max Verstappen still finished ahead of him, as I think the P1 guys quoted, even with 1 lap on 3 tyres, Perez still wasn't able to beat his teammates. So I do think Red Bull, again, much like the driver of the day, the pit stops weren't quite there, even though I definitely expected more from them. And the fact that Ferrari put in 2 really quick ones makes me think they could be certainly a candidate for that moving forward. So that becomes very appealing to me. I think the DNFs, we're going to talk about this every single race week for the foreseeable future. It is going to be a factor in our plans, and it is a bit of a tricky circuit. We saw that huge collision on the first lap a couple of years ago, and it is by no means one of the easy ones on the calendar. So I do think that is something to keep in mind. If we see anywhere between 3 and 5 drivers not finish the race in Silverstone, that's going to play into the hands of the C-tier drivers. But I think for me, I'm not going to want to bank on DNFs to improve the price increases or whatever it might be for those C-tier drivers. So I think I'll probably end up running a double B with 3 C-tiers or something like that in Silverstone, which probably opens the door for wildcard. But again, we'll talk about that momentarily. And then driver of the day. I won't ramble as I say I won't every week, but it's just crazy that Lando is just churning these out left, right, and center. So I do think, even though he is an A-tier asset, he won't go up more than 0.2 million, but can go down 0.7 million in a single week. I think that almost guaranteed 10 plus points is a huge bonus for anyone running him. So definitely has a huge appeal to me, and it could well be that I end up running him again in Silverstone for his home Grand Prix. And I do think there's a little bit of nostalgia there. So George, Lewis, Lando could all be candidates if they're looking good throughout the race on the Sunday. So this is what my team was in Austria. A couple of price drops, a couple of price increases, nothing for 3 of the assets in my team. So team values, not pretty at all. We could probably just empty out the team for those of you curious. Not sure how many of you actually are, but it is 117.6. Could be a lot higher, certainly could be a lot lower. But yeah, not great. And as I said, wildcard is certainly on the table for me this weekend. There's a number of different ways I could slice it. And I think realistically, one such approach would be to take another -10, which I'm really not that keen on. I just took one. It was my 3rd of the season. It didn't pay off. Well, no, I think it was going to pay off. I'll put it that way, until Lando and Max collided. But I don't want to get into a habit of taking these every single week, because I think over time they just naturally won't pay off. Unless, of course, there's a very good reason for why I would need to take it. So I think, without needing to use a wild card to kind of mix up my team, I could do something like Mercedes, Ferrari, and drop in George Russell. That would mean I'm capped out fully. It wouldn't mean Lando Norris, and it wouldn't mean Logan Sargent, and I can still field Lando Norris. You're also getting 2 B-tier assets, and I think what I like about this is that we're just going to see, unless there are DNFs, prices for these assets go up each week, which are going to far outstrip the likes of McLaren and Red Bull. Now, I guess I could have held on to one of these two assets in Austria, and maybe that was it probably was the right decision in hindsight, but I had no idea this was going to eventuate. So I think this could be an easy move that is pretty low risk, still covering off Lando Norris. Ferrari, as I said, looking good for the pit stops at the moment, and Mercedes seem to be very consistent. Now, if for whatever reason I do want to run another double B, but I want to bring in McLaren instead, actually Lando probably would stay, but it would, I mean, could he stay? Maybe, maybe not. Another such lineup could be something like this. And I think that would just be enough for either one of Mercedes or Ferrari. Now, I like this. I think the one thing I will say, it's less obvious who the best 2X driver is between these two. I think both have been super consistent of late. We go over at F1 Fantasy Tools. You know, Oscar's best result, which maybe inflates his scores lately, which were less impressive in Canada and Spain. But I have said, as I mentioned before, he has been building to something and has been on the little... has had a little bit of bad luck lately. So both options, but I do think it is much less clear as opposed to running a Lando Norris and a George Russell. And I think running Ferrari is probably a little bit more consistent. Is a little less consistent as of right now, because I do think Mercedes and McLaren are far superior teams. So, I mean, that's one such option. I mean, the other would be to stick with Lando, but it would mean a likely downgrade to Logan Sargent. So I don't really want to run Logan, only because he is just continually dropping in price. Guaranteed less than 5 points just about every weekend, unless there's extenuating circumstances, as we've seen a couple times this season. So I could do something like that. If I want to hedge my bets on McLaren, it could be a Ferrari driver. It could be a Mercedes driver. But I do think having Lando is probably the best 2X driver in the game right now. So quite a few different combinations. I think when there's a bit more news later in the week on upgrades and all that stuff in Silverstone, I'll revisit what my team's looking like. But I just don't see long-term Red Bull factoring into my plans unless we suddenly see a change in fortunes from Sergio Perez. But I'm just not seeing it at the moment from the Mexican. Even DNFs aside, 8, 8, and 7 in the race and qualifying, I think, is really not all that much different, if I'm being honest. 8, 8, and 11. So you can definitely see his form tailing off after that sprint when the other teams brought in upgrades. Red Bulls clearly have not been able to match the pace that Mercedes, McLaren, and maybe even Ferrari have brought through. So I just don't know if Perez's consistencies or inconsistencies are going to improve anytime soon. And that's probably about as high as I do see him going in terms of qualifying and race pace, unless there are DNFs ahead of him. So there is a few obvious concerns about Red Bull, but right now the team is certainly looking like it could be a Mercedes McLaren flavor moving into the weeks ahead. But I think I'm going to park it there for now, guys. Obviously a lot to dissect after a pretty wild Austrian sprint weekend, but let me know how you got on in the comments below, because I've seen a lot of really good results on Twitter from people over 200 points and a couple like me who have had to suffer through the Lando Norris and Red Bull catastrophe. But anyway, that's it for today. As always, appreciate you guys dropping by. I'll be back with my final thoughts later in the week, and I'll see you all very soon.